Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's CITI program webinar. Today's topic, Understanding Consent Requirements and Key Information under the Revised Rule, and is presented by Misti, Ault, Anderson. This webinar will be recorded, and the recording will be available on the CITI program's website. Let me tell you about today's presenter, Misti, Ault, Anderson. Prior to joining OHRP, Ms. Anderson was a senior policy and research analyst at the Presidential Commission for the Study of Bioethical Issues, where she served as staff lead for the Bioethics Commission's educational materials and for both volumes of the Bioethics Commission's Gray Matters report on neuroscience and ethics. She holds an MS in biomedical science policy and advocacy from Georgetown University, an MA in science education from UNC Chapel Hill, and a BS in microbiology from Clemson University.
All right, the learning objectives for today's webinar are as follows. First, we will explain the new regulatory requirements for understandability in informed consent. Second, we'll talk about developing consent materials that reflect what potential participants need to know and what they need to understand in order to make autonomous decisions about whether to participate in the research. And third, we're going to talk about what types of information might be considered key information when you are developing your informed consent materials. The main purpose of informed consent goes all the way back to the Belmont Report from 1978. And one of the principles, of course, in the Belmont Report is respect for persons, which specifies that individuals are autonomous agents that should be treated as autonomous individuals and not as a mere means to someone else's end. So informed consent really operationalizes this ethical principle in that it insists that if you are asking someone to join your research, they need to be able to have the power to make their own autonomous decision to do so. Or if they are unable to do so, that a legally authorized representative with that person's interest in mind is able to make that decision. So strategies for organizing the information in your informed consent in such a way that you can facilitate understanding. So first of all, let's talk about plain language. You can communicate the information in an informed consent document as clearly as possible for the lay reader or potential subject by using plain language principles as much as you can. So, these include write in active voice, make it very direct for them. This is what we will do. This is what will happen for you. This is what you can expect. Use pronouns to really place the responsibility who's doing what and what you can expect so that they can understand it from their point of view. When you can do it, avoid medical jargon and acronyms. If you absolutely cannot avoid it, at least define it so that it is understandable moving forward. But if it's possible to describe instead of just using a technical term, I definitely encourage you to do so. Avoid complex words if you can. This is probably easier than avoiding medical jargon and acronyms because complex words, it's easier to replace them. There's not always, just only one way to say it, like sometimes is the case with medical terms. Use common and everyday words. Sometimes it requires more words, but if it makes it more understandable, that's a reasonable trade-off. Use short sentences and break up complex ideas into their own sentences. So you don't need a sentence with 4 or 5. All right, now for the final part of this presentation, I want to talk with you a little bit about this new key information requirement in the regulations and about discerning what might be key information. I think we get a lot of questions on this, and so we're really trying to help everyone understand what key information means. So this is what I showed you earlier. This is the regulatory requirement here. But essentially, it is that your overall informed consent has to begin with this concise and focused presentation of the key information, most likely to assist a prospective subject to understand why one might or might not want to participate in the research. So the question is, how do I figure out what might be that key information to help someone understand? Now, I will say that the regulation goes on to say, and the preamble to the regulation talks about, well, this is likely to include purposes, risks, benefits, and alternatives, but is not limited to that. And This has tripped up a number of people because people are saying, oh, well, this is what I have to include then, and we're going to template it based on this. And I caution you against that. What I really encourage you to do is think about studies critically and what makes them different from other studies so that you can actually get at what would be most important for folks thinking about joining this particular study to know and understand first before they move forward through the rest of the informed consent document. So first of all, let's think about just some basic examples, right, of why one might or might not want to participate in a hypothetical study. So, sometimes it helps, again, to put things side by side and to really look at them. So, one reason someone might want to participate in a study is they might think to themselves, I want to help researchers find a better treatment for future patients like me. Right? Whether or not this helps me is one thing, but I can help other people like me in the future. I have little or no preference for whether I receive the test treatment in whichever study group I'm in. I'm willing to accept the 50-50 chance of this randomization. Putting this in terms of thinking in the first person can help people when they read it, then they can decide, oh, I resonate with that. Yes, that describes how I feel. Or, no, that's not how I see it. And so then that can help them make their decision. Another reason someone might want to participate is participating in this research gives me a chance to get this study drug at no financial cost to me, perhaps. And for some folks, that's a driving reason to join a study. It's certainly not the one that we want to highlight the most, but it is a reason. And so just a few things finally to kind of wrap this up and point out that in the requirements for understandability broadly, it specifies that all the informed consent document and information has to be provided in sufficient detail and organized and presented in such a way as to facilitate understanding. That includes key information. So when you're putting together your key information, again, think about the presentation, how you can provide this information to help it be more understandable and make more sense to your prospective participants. In addition, and this is important, I haven't said this yet, there's not a requirement to repeat information. So if you have the information in the key information, you don't have to repeat it later. You can, there's not a prohibition against it, but I say this because the important thing is that we give the information to the prospective participants. We are not just trying to make your informed consent document longer by adding the key information up front. We're trying to make it more understandable and accessible to the reader. So there's not a requirement to repeat. So if you have a fairly simple and low risk study and your informed consent document is relatively short, it's possible your key information isn't even a page. Maybe it's a half page. But because it's all short, there's no need to repeat. So it's just something to think about, pointing out that this is not necessarily, doesn't have to be a repetitive kind of idea. And just a reminder that as you figure out what your key information is, understand that it's all about the context of the study you're thinking need and making sure that I'm giving them all the information. If you think that this information would be helpful to you, you can this little thing here on the bottom is a little button that we have made available. This is a public website. We want anyone who thinks it would be helpful to access it, and these materials are all free for you to use. So with that, I'll go ahead and wrap up and just remind you that while we talked in kind of everyday language today, you can find all the regulatory language and lots of tools and helpful information about applying the revised rule on OHRP's website, which is www.hhs.gov/OHRP, and we welcome your questions. Please send them anytime to us via email at ohrp@hhs.gov, and we are happy to answer those questions. Thank you so much for your attention.
So we do have a few questions from the folks. A very first one, if biological specimens or data are collected for non-research purposes, say public health surveillance during the current COVID outbreak, could those materials later be used for research if first fully anonymized and without having obtained informed consent for the purpose of research?
Okay, so that's a great question. So if you have samples that were collected, and this would also go for information, incidentally. So even in the same context, right, of this outbreak, there might be taking a lot of information, survey questions and such. So it would go for that and for specimens. If it is stored and it is completely de-identified and used later, right, biospecimens and information that would fall under that category. So it's secondary use. And if it is not identifiable, then it actually does not meet the regulatory definition of human subjects. So yes, it could be used in research if it was collected for a completely other purpose and it was not identifiable, then it could be used.
We do encourage everyone to monitor the City Program's website for additional information about future webinars, available on-demand recordings of past webinars, and our all-new All Access webinar package.